Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price but stay for the service.
And welcome back. We are about to commence our first discussion of the morning. We have with us online via Zoom Attorney at Law Christopher Koyi, and he's going to be discussing with us the existing state of Belize's economy and what happens going forward in the context of the election's outcome on November 11th. Good morning, Chris.
Hi, morning. Morning, everyone.
Good morning. Now we have a very broad conversation this morning in terms of the discussion on the state of the economy. You are someone who is very versed in economics and the way government goes about managing the overall state of play there. Let's begin by getting from you an overview, your perspective of where we are currently as a country in terms of the economy.
Okay. As a quick overview, just to get that context, as you said, we have to appreciate where we were pre-COVID and where we are now, as COVID has impacted us terribly. By March or early March, when the onset of COVID came in, we were already in recession. I think the first quarter we had contracted roughly 4.5% of GDP, and the previous 3 quarters we were already contracting as well. So our economy was already in a precarious state when COVID came into the picture. Mm-hmm. Our unemployment rate was already in excess of 10%. Our poverty rate, as you know, is in the vicinity of 50%. And our debt to GDP was roughly 95%. So overall, we were already in a troubling state. Looking at the situation involving COVID, we didn't have much buffer, much contingency. I don't appreciate that there was any contingency fund in place that we would have, or that would have helped us or prepared us for the onset of COVID. Since COVID, things obviously have gotten a lot worse. Tourism, which has been touted as the largest component of our economy, representing roughly 45% of GDP, employing over 40% of our labor force, and representing 42% of total exports. That's been virtually non-existent. Cruise tourism, overnight tourism, that's all completely gone away. The impact has been tremendous in terms of our economy, the GDP, which is that measure of our income, of the country's income. I think in the second quarter, it shrunk by almost a quarter, like 23.3%, according to the Statistical Institute of Belize. The unemployment rate has skyrocketed to over 25%. In some quarters, the impression is that the real unemployment rate is over 30%. Foreign exchange, of course, remains a concern with all the tourism receipts disappearing. So overall, there are many concerns. Of crisis proportions is the debt. The debt has increased from that 95% of GDP to over 130% in just a matter of 6 months. Wow. And that's what I would say is the formal or official debt. We have other debts, judgment debts that exceed $400 million, and debts in connection with land acquisitions of around 100 million or in excess of 100 million. So if you account for all of those additional government debts, the debt to GDP is easily in excess of 140% of GDP. So we from a debt standpoint, we are in critical state. That said, as far as the government's fiscal position, recurrent revenues, to my understanding, has fallen off roughly 30%. The approved budget had estimated a primary surplus, a little budgetary surplus of around 100 million. If we go project out to the end of the fiscal year with that 30% shortfall, and with recurrent expenditures not dropping off by much, maybe 2%, the expectation is that we will have a budget deficit of over $300 million. So we are fiscally in a sad position, to put it nicely.
And I was going to say sad would be a very mild word to describe what you just painted. And, you know, I wanted to, putting this in context, as people head to the polls, we're hearing manifesto launches taking place and hearing quite a bit of, you know, the lofty promises that we usually do before elections. And based on what you've just described, it seems that any administration that takes office after November 11th, this has to be the primary focus from within the first day, how to get things back on track. Now, from what you've described in looking at the loss of foreign exchange, or the massive reduction in foreign exchange, the trickle of tourism that we're seeing at this time, looking at unemployment and what the SIB calls underemployment as well, which is a very big category. Where do you see the priorities? If you had to prioritize some of these areas, what would be the focus?
That's a good question. There are several priorities. There aren't any just one priority. Obviously, you have to look at the social situation and the jobs, the economy. That's where there has to be focus. A second priority has to be in the area of the debt, the debt management. And debt management, not just in terms of existing debt, but let's say over the foreseeable future, a 5-year plan or beyond that, we have to look at how do we manage debt. When you take a more economic policy view or approach to the state of the economy, it's not about going into a situation of absolute austerity. In fact, the conventional wisdom now is that you maintain an expansionary policy, both in terms of fiscal and monetary. What we have right now, if you look at the banking system, for example, we have quite a bit of liquidity. We have, I think, over 350 million in excess liquidity in the banking system. So we don't necessarily have a credit crunch, if you were to look at it from that standpoint. But what we have more is, in effect, a crisis of confidence. The banks themselves are investors in our economy, and if they don't have a level of confidence in one sector versus another, one business versus another, then they won't lend. So that represents an area that requires urgent attention. The government is also a player in the economy, a substantial player in the economy. It's a market participant, so it obviously has a role to play. So that on the banking side, what can be done by central bank and what kind of creative efforts can be taken, that has to be looked at. And on the government side, looking at how does it demonstrate its confidence in the economy as well. The government has to step up, and at this point in time, how does it do that if it has that burgeoning debt on its plate? That is where obviously the government has to play a participative role with the private sector. The private sector is the engine of growth for the economy, and I would say for too long it has been allowed to languish. That is an area where I think we have to look at to combine the efforts to get that partnership between public and private sector, and looking in fact at what has been referred to as
Here's my question, Chris. When we look at the fact that there will be a new administration taking office in the days ahead, and you look at April 1st, 2021, when a new fiscal year is set to commence with a new budget, and if we're already looking at the fact that we're teetering on the brink, we're in a very critical state in terms of our economy, then a new budget would only mean more monies either being borrowed, or there's a shortfall in terms of where we are presently versus what we will need in order for us to continue with any form of physical activity in the upcoming year. What is your point of view on something like that?
In terms of the government's budget, you can't look at just 1 year. You have to look over, like I mentioned, a plan, having a plan over a period of time. You won't have an immediate bounce back, but certainly I expect that next year will be a return to growth, which will mean an improvement in the recurrent revenues. The expenditures obviously has to be addressed. You have to look at how you streamline your expenditures to improve that fiscal position. Capital expenditures have to be maintained. As I mentioned, you have to maintain that level of expansionary policy, both from a fiscal and a monetary standpoint. It has to be more targeted and the funds not squandered. In terms of looking at every expenditure, you have to look at it more from an investment standpoint, even including from the government. What is spent, there has to be a return, whether it's a short or a long term. In this case, more likely a long-term investment return. But expenditures have to be made in the form of investments. Capital expenditures have to be done in that format.
You know, as we discuss this, I think one of the things that we do know for certain, and the Prime Minister himself has said, is that whoever takes over after November 11th will have some really tough decisions to make. As you clearly pointed out, with the level of debt that we do have, and the reduction in revenue because of tourism, we also know there's some big expenses that lie ahead as well. Let's talk about decision-making processes, or what opportunities exist to even meet the expenses that are to come when we talk about continuing or getting through the pandemic.
In terms of revenue, certainly, as I mentioned, this where we are in terms of the pandemic, recall that we were in a shutdown. Obviously, that has a major impact across the board, including fiscally. Looking forward, that expectation is that there will be a significant return to growth. Now, that impacts on the collections of the government, on its recurrent revenues. That said, there are areas in terms of revenue enhancement, in spite of not looking at increasing tax collections, increasing any tax rates at this point in time. Areas, for example, that involve reverse discrimination, as an example, as between what is manufactured in Belize versus what is imported from CARICOM. We have an environmental tax that exempts items coming in from CARICOM, but all the raw materials that are used to produce in Belize, in any kind of manufacturing activity in Belize, is not exempt. That doesn't make any sense for our local manufacturing whatsoever. So that can be adjusted so that there is in fact a level playing field, and ultimately that would mean revenue enhancement for the government. There are other examples of that, for example, in GST, with respect to items that in meat products, for example, the basic meat products might not be subject to the derivatives of basic meat products on import are zero rated, yet meat products in Belize or those derivatives that may be produced in Belize are subject to GST. Again, that's in effect a reverse discrimination position that could easily be rectified and in effect generate additional revenues. In terms of customs collection, we all know that there is a lot that can be done there to broaden the tax base rather than increase any rate of tax. So the expectation is that could increase tax revenues by roughly 15%. Customs collections represent between around almost 50% of total recurrent revenue. So 15% of $500 million is roughly 75 million in additional revenues that could be generated. So there are areas where we can increase current revenues, and at the same time areas where we can look at streamlining expenditures.
So what you're talking about is better enforcement of when you talk about customs, for example, that's one area. But even looking at the productive sector, and we know that the focus on agriculture has been one that people have discussed for a very long time. When you look at the competitiveness of our products, or perhaps negotiating deals with new markets, are these also areas that can be explored to help us earn more money, essentially?
Yes, I'm glad you raised that. Certainly, as far as the economy and having a broader and more diversified economy, the agricultural sector certainly has shown itself to be a critical or integral part of our economy, and an area that can be enhanced significantly. That said, that's not to say that agriculture is in any way intended to be a substitute for tourism, but an additional enhanced contributor. Tourism will be a key part of our economy going forward and will continue to be supported. But in terms of agriculture, when we look at its performance over the past couple decades, it has shrunken, and a large part of that is market access. Reversing the shrinkage in market access is what we need to do, and places of priority from day one will be our neighbors, in particular Mexico. In terms of increasing market access, that's a natural place to look forward to. Operating or acting more smartly and effectively in terms of CARICOM is another area where we can enhance market access. So I agree with you in terms of agriculture. Improving market access will certainly be areas of focus, and providing more access to credit as well. But in terms of enabling that sector, the result will be increased exports, which in turn support our foreign exchange reserves, but also enhances the economy and economic activity overall.
Chris, is there a figure, looking at the debt that we've acquired over the COVID period so far, is there a figure as to how much we've borrowed so far?
I think it's just over the COVID period, you mean? Well, overall right now, I think that the total debt, official debt, is over $4 billion. When you add in the other debts that I mentioned, we're at $4.5 billion. Over the last 6 months, I think we're around 350 million of new debt that we've taken on, in some domestic and some international.
This would be extremely difficult for any new administration to try to shave within a 5-year period, given the existing state of affairs, Chris.
Yeah, I guess you have to look at it different ways. Certainly, we have to look at how we can reduce the overall debt. Whether that may mean some level of negotiation with relevant parties. That's something you have to look at, and tough decisions will have to be made from that standpoint. But also you have to look at how do you stretch out your payment obligations for the long haul, so that it does not become an overriding burden on your recurrent budget. So you have to take several approaches or actions to make it livable.
No, and that was my point in looking at how much debt we owe, because at some point we will have to pay the debt that the money that we've borrowed. But you know, when you mentioned earlier that you don't have to be, I don't remember the right word you used, but we know that it is a time of austerity, and the big conversation coming at the forefront that naturally many people are concerned about, what does this mean for our public wage bill? It has been a point of conversation over and over, and now the PSU is bringing it to the forefront right before an election, kind of trying to get leaders to say they will not cut down the wage bill, or that people won't lose their jobs right before an election. But we do know that the public wage bill has been a heavy burden on the administration for a while. What are your thoughts there as to how this issue can be addressed?
Yes, let me look at some of the numbers there in terms of the wage bill. I think based on the approved estimates, the emoluments and pensions represented 46% of the expected recurrent revenues, 38% emoluments, 8% pensions, adding up to 46% of the recurrent revenues for the approved 2021 budget. With the shortfall of roughly 30% in recurrent revenues, that has meant that the emoluments and pensions roughly represent now 67% of the recurrent revenues. So yes, it's by far and away the largest part of the recurrent budget. As far as, and we don't have all the statistics, there is a little bit of lag in terms of getting all the data when you're not in government. So that's what we believe the case to be. But clearly that needs to be addressed. The government, as far as we understand, is in a position where it's ultimately borrowing every month to meet its monthly bills, including the wage bill. Obviously, that is unsustainable, and there has to be a discussion had with the public sector to review what can be done to put the budget on a sustainable path. In terms of the labor force, I understand it's roughly 16,000 persons making up the labor force, but that does include about 15% being open vote workers. All those things have to be reviewed and looked at in detail to understand what is the the true position, and examine what can be done. In terms of pension, for example, there appears to be varying rules that apply whether you're public officer, your school teachers pension, whether your what's the other one, National Assembly, different rules that apply, some of which are not consistent with each other. And in fact, they are all unfunded liabilities. So those are things that clearly need to be reviewed and a discussion had where the reality is placed in front of everyone to see, so that we can look together to see what can be done realistically going forward.
Well, I guess the question, the core of the question is, does a reduction or working on reducing the public wage bill equal job loss for public officers?
I don't know that there's a consideration of job loss for the public service. That's, like I mentioned earlier in our conversation, we also have to look at government as a spender in the economy. And what does that spending mean? That does mean income for everybody else. So that does include income for public officers as well. So we always have to look at how do we get ourselves out of this current economic situation. And it's not about being entirely austere, but it is about ensuring that you're operating sustainably.
When we look at the fact that there are 16,000 public officers working across this country, that's a fairly huge number in terms of government perhaps being the single largest employer, and a majority of what happens in terms of the economy is driven by the private sector. I think I want to piggyback on the question that Marlene asked earlier. Well, notwithstanding the fact that reduction in the wage bill or the sending home of public officers may not necessarily be at the forefront of the discussion at this point, considering the fact that we are in an election season. But the simple nature that this may not be sustainable is something that will have to be addressed down the road by whomever, whichever party wins, whichever administration takes over as of November 12th, seriously has to look at what you're putting forward, perhaps as a measure of austerity, as you've said, or coming up with some other plan that would be equally as effective in addressing this particular issue.
Well, I just want to come back to you on that. I didn't speak about being taking austerity measures. I think we just have to take smarter decisions.
Smarter decisions.
In terms of how do we spend government's money, I get back to that comment that we have to look at how we invest. That ultimately means that there is a return for the government and for ultimately the taxpayer. I'll give an example. When we look at the monetary policy and the monetary position or the banking of the banking system, there is much more that can be done insofar as economic activity is concerned. Like I mentioned, there's quite a bit of excess liquidity, but it's not moving. So how do we enhance or engineer more economic activity? I'll give an example. In the US, the Federal Reserve has its policy tools that it utilizes on a relatively aggressive basis, especially since the financial crisis of 2008 and even now in the COVID crisis of 2020. These policy tools, including using SPVs, special purpose vehicles, which are utilized to support economic activity and business on a whole. As an example, let's look at the municipalities. There's a municipal lending program where an SPV is established, funded by initial equity by the government, but leveraged by the Federal Reserve, as much as 10 times leverage. What that does is enable a participative approach between the government and the central bank, in that case the Federal Reserve, to provide substantial liquidity at reduced interest rates for municipalities to enable them to continue doing what work they do. Similarly, you have another facility, I think they referred to it as the Main Street lending facilities. In those examples, those are earmarked for small to medium-sized businesses. In the U.S., they're small to medium-sized businesses, bigger than our big businesses. But that said, using a similar vehicle for providing financing, credit facilities become available that they would not otherwise have had access to in the regular banking system at reduced rates. What does that do? That certainly supports the continuation or the new generation of economic activity for the economy. Yeah. So there are creative ways that we can utilize to turn this economy around. Yeah. It's not just 1 + 1 = 2 and A, B, and C. We can do a lot more than what we've been doing.
It's going to require a lot of innovation. I think that's what I'm hearing, looking at what works in other areas and what can be adapted for Belize. When you talk, though, about looking at assisting the business community, be it small or micro businesses, we also have to look at the reality of how businesses are doing at this time. And it brings us back to one of the first issues that came on the table, and that's unemployment and underemployment. Businesses need people to be able to access their products and services. If there's not enough going into the pockets of people, of families, they don't have the spending power to be able to do what they typically do. How do we work on this issue?
That I guess there's an interplay there. I mean, without an employer, there's no employee. So we need employers, we need businesses to work, and it's almost circular, because then with that employee, it has her income. They spend that money, and that becomes income for somebody else, another employer, another business, and so there's that circulation, that velocity of money that we need to happen. To get that to happen, there has to be that willingness to invest, and that's where I come back to: how do we get investors to invest? And I mentioned about the banking sector, the 350 million in excess liquidity that could be utilized to support credit for businesses so that they invest. So the banking sector can ramp up their investment. The government can ramp up their investment, and the central bank in its monetary policy can enable the ramping up of that investment. All those efforts all together, along and with the private sector participating in that effort, will mean an increased velocity of money or circulation of money that will mean income for all.
You started off by saying that the economy is in a sad state. Looking forward, and knowing, having discussed all that we have, what concerns you the most? What's the one thing we must get under control as quickly as possible before it gets any worse?
I would say psychology is at the heart of many things, but including our economy.
Yeah.
The pessimism we need to change to optimism. We have to have confidence in each other and confidence in the future. If we can have that, then we don't have anything to worry about. If we can use our wit, our creativity, our common sense, we don't have to be dependent. We can be independent. We can change that culture of dependency, needing to look for somebody else to solve a problem for us, to give us a job. That's the change. That's what the concern I have, but
Yeah.
that's how I see that we can address concern.
And I guess you answered the last question I was going to ask there in terms of opportunity. So the opportunity is being able to see the possibilities that can exist in being able to take care or to address our own problems as well.
No, exactly. I think it's within our scope of abilities to turn this around. We certainly can enjoy the benefit of support from others, regional and multilateral partners, but we can't assume that we will have that, so that we must look at within ourselves and see how we can turn our economy around.
Okay. All right. Well, we thank you for joining us this morning and having this conversation, taking a deeper look at the state of the economy, and thank you for the insight.
Thank you, too.
All right. And with that, we're going to go ahead and take a break from talking about the economy to talking about education. We're going to be joined by representatives of the BNTU after the break.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.